Hello everybody and welcome back to the second day of MozFest. My name is Jiva Kusunu and I will be your host in this room yesterday and today. And I am looking forward so much to today because if yesterday was anything to go by, I think we're in for a lot of great conversations, beautiful insights, a lot of fun. Who else was yesterday buzzing in their bed singing freedom? Right? It was so good. And for the people who are like, what is she talking about? Come back for the closing circle tonight, you'll know. And of course, there's lots more to do today as well. There's over 80 workshops, conversations, roundtables, exhibitions, interactive art installations. And I'm curious, who was there yesterday as well? Raise hands. Okay, so most of you. Claire, what was your favorite part of yesterday?
Probably Toshi Reagan.
Also, right? Yeah, it's just such a great way also to end the day singing all together. So definitely check out this session. But first, we'll dive into something that concerns all of us, because I'm sure you recognize this feeling of being cheated when you ordered something online. You think you have a great deal, but at checkout, there's all kinds of extra charges that have been added. Or when you are becoming super annoyed of a subscription that was super easy to purchase, but almost impossible to cancel. Yeah, people feel it? Well, we've all been there. Kush Amlani, Global Competition and Regulatory Counsel at Mozilla Corporation, will lead the next conversation about what we can do or should do about these tricks. So give it up for Kush and his guests.
Thanks, everyone. So, I'm Kush Amlani. I'm Global Competition and Regulatory Counsel at Mozilla. And really looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today. We're talking about deceptive design and regulation in the EU, which is a really hot topic. But actually, it's not a hot topic, my panelists, because they've been looking at this for a long time. So joining me, we have, and I promised I wouldn't butcher his name, but I'm about to, Dries Cuijpers, who's a lawyer at the Consumer Division of the Netherlands Authority for Consumers and Markets, and currently coordinates their work in the digital economy. And we have Constanta Rosca, a multidisciplinary PhD researcher at Maastricht University. Her PhD research combines consumer law and computer science insights to explore legal and technical solutions for the interpretation and enforcement of the regulation of dark patterns. So thank you for joining us. And before we begin, just to say, we'll be taking questions at the end, so feel free to add to the discussion as we go along. And so we wanted to start by anchoring the discussion with some concrete examples of dark patterns. You know, what do we mean? What do they look like? So I'd love for our panel to talk us through some examples that they've brought along for us all to look at. So Dries, if we start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kush, and also thank you for doing a brilliant job on my name. I couldn't have done it any better. So, so there's basically two dark patterns that I brought along for you today. And the first one is related to a case that the Authority for Consumers and Markets conducted in 2013. And why I mention the year is that it goes to show that dark patterns is nothing new, and that also us dealing with dark patterns is nothing new. Probably the only difference is that we didn't call it dark patterns back then. But you know, the issue that we have at hand in this example is exactly something that we would call deceptive design or dark patterns. So to illustrate to you very quickly what's happening and what you're looking at, you are looking at an extract from the website of the low-cost carrier Ryanair. Well, we all know that what Ryanair sells, they sell flight tickets. So if you bought a ticket, you would then proceed to the next page on the website where you would probably be offered a rental car, a hotel, and you would get the option between brackets to get a travel insurance. Now, it's important here to mention that most Dutch people do have a permanent travel insurance. So having an additional one is really not necessary for most of Dutch people. Now, if you were to get around getting a travel insurance, you had to opt out, first of all. And the way to opt out was to go to the drop-down menu where you were selecting your country of origin for insurance purposes. You would have to click the drop-down menu and you would have to find "Don't insure me" between Denmark and Finland. Well, I don't think I have to say much more about this, right? So Ryanair was fine for this practice. They changed, and I think this is a great example of something that is both very simple but also very effective.
Thank you, Dries. And you have a second example as well.
Yes, absolutely. So there's a video that goes with it, which I'm happy to show if that's possible. Let me just very quickly set the scene. The joint European consumer authorities ordered or have taken commitments from Amazon last year that they were going to make their cancellation process, and you already mentioned it, and I saw a lot of people laugh, so this is an example that is widely recognized, I would imagine, that commitments from Amazon to make their subscription process easier. And when I say easier, I mean reduce it from about 40 plus clicks and I don't know how many dark patterns to a 2-click process. So this common action, as we call it in Europe, has inspired also some legislators, for example, in France and in Germany, to introduce, let's say, design requirements or cancellation requirements that make it much easier to cancel online subscriptions. I just want to show you a quick video on what the cancellation process of Amazon Prime looked in Europe prior to our intervention. And some of you may know. Yeah, thank you for showing that. I think that really sums it up. This is how difficult it was to end. And there is, and I'm saying we did not investigate, but if you go online and search, there is some research that has been done by Business Insider in the US, where they actually found leaked documents of Amazon that this was a deliberate program to make cancellations difficult, and that it was actually saving them 14% of cancellations on an annual basis. So if you can do a little bit of math, you know how much this is worth. So all credits to the Norwegian Consumer Council for making this great video.
Thank you. And Constanta, let's come to you now.
This is an example of hidden subscription on Figma. So a hidden subscription is when we're not informed about the fact that we're subscribing. This often occurs with free trials. So we get lured in by a free trial and then the subscription starts. This is one of the worst examples of this practice that I've seen. And this dark pattern was found on Figma in 2021 and 2022. A lot of Figma users, and by the way, Figma is Adobe's UI design tool, so I think it's quite ironic that they were using this dark pattern. So a lot of users started complaining that they had paid memberships, and once they shared a design with someone in their team, and they gave that person the ability to edit a design, that would silently also extend their subscription to that user. So they'd only realize after the end of the billing cycle that they'd taken out additional subscriptions. That's not to say that that's what Figma is doing right now. I haven't checked that. And this is an example from Deceptive Design. And hidden subscription also in the wild frequently co-occurs with hard to cancel, which is what Amazon was doing. So there is a lot of potential for financial detriment when these dark patterns are coupled together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll come on to the harms shortly. And we have another example as well.
So this is an example of some friction in the Facebook account deletion process. So we've seen in Dries' example that friction in processes like account termination or subscription termination can be detrimental to users. However, in the case of this particular screen, I'm not so sure if that's the case. We could argue that it does add some additional friction, but at the same time, it's quite informative. And it also it informs the user about the consequences of deleting their Facebook account, but also gives them some actions that they can directly undertake from this screen. And it's also really easy to continue. The continue button is highlighted. So especially with processes like hard to cancel, I think sometimes we need to also protect the user from themselves, for example, to prevent accidental deletion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so sometimes friction is important. That's very interesting. I've slightly abused my moderator privilege and got a couple of examples myself as well that I wanted to show. One is from December, and the FTC took action against Epic Games for some the way they dealt with their game store. So they advertised Fortnite as being free, but when you scroll down below the fold, you'll see that there are in-app purchases, and actually it turns out that there was no friction to for kids in particular to make other purchases of games. And so what it led to was a lot of customers accidentally buying games and not being warned. And particularly with the PlayStation as well and the controllers, you would see the buttons are very close together, and it was very easy to accidentally press buy a game. And as a result of that, they ended up paying the FTC nearly $250 million in settlement. And then I wanted to talk about something in the browser space, which is very close to my heart. And so you may find this, that when you're using a browser on Windows, for example, you have to do a mandatory update. And one thing that I've been noticing recently was that when you do that update, you often are displayed with this screen at the end of the update. And what it does is it suggests you use Microsoft's recommended browser settings. And there's a fingerprint, there's a lock, it suggests it's for your security. What you don't realize is that when you press apply settings, which is pre-selected, you end up switching your default browser to Microsoft Edge and away from whichever browser you are otherwise using. And I think this is pretty common, and another example of a more subtle deceptive pattern that we see as well. So there's some examples to kind of give a bit of anchoring and help people to understand exactly what it is we're talking about. Now let's come on to the kind of regulatory landscape. And Constanta, I'd love to kind of start with you, and if you could explain a little bit, first of all, in terms of definitions, and we sort of defined it now, and would love to kind of talk about the impact on consumers. So would you be able to tell us a little bit about what is the harm to consumers of deceptive patterns? Why should people care about it?
So starting with the definitions,
Yes.
I think that there isn't really one unitary definition. A paper from 2021 from researchers at Princeton University compared 19 definitions that they found in prior studies, and they found out that the definitions differed in terms of elements that are required for a practice to be considered a dark pattern, but also there were within study and across study discrepancies between the definition and the practices that were actually analyzed. So what the researchers proposed is that the literature try to create cohesiveness for itself, and that researchers try to refer to dark patterns in terms of how they modify the choice architecture. So some dark patterns can hide information, they manipulate the information flow, and others, like hard to cancel, for example, are restrictive, so they impact our decision space. However, I haven't seen a lot of take-up in the computer science literature on the topic of this so far, but I think it's a great starting point, also because they suggested that the literature should link the practices that they describe to normative considerations. Mm-hmm. So that's something that we do see more now. So the literature has identified several harms when it comes to dark patterns. There can be individual harms, so we can end up spending more money. For example, when we're trapped in a subscription like we saw, but we would otherwise like to cancel. There could be also privacy harms when dark patterns are used in a notice and consent context. The literature recently started looking at attentional harms. So some dark patterns are engaging. They are meant to keep us using a service for a longer time. And if we do it for long enough, we could even speak about digital addiction, which is a psychological harm, but it's a psychological harm that could lead to financial harms because it's easier to exploit a user that is addicted to a service. And at a collective level, consumers could lose trust in the market if everyone deploys dark patterns, and they could not be matched with the best seller on the merits of an offer, so there could be also competition harms.
Thank you. And Dries, coming to you now, how do you delineate between dark patterns in terms of, is all choice architecture positive or negative? How do we identify what is a dark pattern?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to be a bit provocative here and say, so the term dark pattern, deceptive design, online choice architecture, or online influencing technique, and these are all terms that are being used, which I would say sort of pointed to similar things, are very interesting definitions or terms to have to make sure that we can have a debate, that we can speak about this, right? That we know that we're talking about the same thing and that we can sort of exchange information and gain deeper understanding. From a legal point of view, from the point of view as a regulator, I don't really need those terms. So what we do is we look at a specific technique, whether it is ranking, social pressure, countdown timers, and we assess this practice based on the legislation. And the legislation predominantly being in Europe, the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, or UCPD in short. So basically what we do is we check, is there a practice going on that's either blacklisted or maybe misleading or aggressive, or which does not match with professional diligence. So to a degree, great to have the discussion on definitions, which we also had in terms of drafting the report which was published by the OECD last year, which is on commercial dark patterns, and which also tries to come up with some sort of definition and also concludes that it really can't. So I think great to do that. Do we need it in terms of practice, in law practice? Not really.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. That is provocative, but also very, very sensible. And Constanta, coming to kind of the regulatory landscape, could you outline for us how it's currently regulated? What is the patchwork that we currently see?
So to pick up on the point that Dries made, I think that for a regulator, definition is not as important as for a policymaker. Mm-hmm. And I think we can see that with the Digital Services Act. I'll get to that in a bit. Yeah. But so in essence, there's several instruments that can be used in the EU to address dark patterns. There's Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, which Dries already mentioned, and it's an instrument that protects consumers' economic interests. Unfair commercial practices are practices that are misleading, that are aggressive, or practices that may breach professional diligence and influence our transactional decisions, such as decisions whether to cancel a service or not, buy a product or not. The UCPD also has an annex which lists some practices that are always prohibited. And the annex refers to fake scarcity messaging as being a prohibited practice. So that's one dark pattern that's explicitly prohibited in the UCPD. Otherwise, we need a case-by-case assessment. To dark patterns that cause privacy harms, we could apply the General Data Protection Regulation, which aims to give data subjects greater control over the use of their personal data. The regulation mentions in its recitals that pre-checked boxes don't amount to valid consent, and this has been confirmed in a judgment by the European Court of Justice. Otherwise, again, we'll have to assess whether a dark pattern breaches the GDPR on a case-by-case basis. And now we also have the Digital Services Act, which in Article 25 prohibits the use of dark patterns on online platforms. So more specifically, what it does is prohibits online platforms from designing or arranging their online interfaces in a way which manipulates, deceives, or otherwise materially impairs or distorts users' well-informed and free decisions. And to come back to the point that I raised earlier as to why definitions are important for policymakers, I think the DSA has created a very large space of influence that could be captured by it because it uses vague terms, but it also hasn't created, I think, a lot of legal certainty as to what is a dark pattern that's captured by the DSA and what isn't. regulators, policymakers typically shy away from regulating manipulation, for example, because it's very hard to pin down, and there aren't any definitions provided in the DSA, unfortunately. And I think we can expect even more regulation. So there's several consumer protection instruments in the pipeline right now, which might introduce a DSA-like ban to several consumer protection instruments, not word-for-word transfers, unfortunately, which I think could, again, perhaps lead to even more legal uncertainty. And the Commission is currently running a fitness check on digital fairness, in which it's assessing the adequacy of current regulations, such as the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, in dealing with, among others, dark patterns. So I think it's a very rich regulatory landscape. It's also a growing regulatory landscape. But I also don't think that the amount of regulation is necessarily a measure of its effectiveness. And to give you an example where some issues might lie, for example, the DSA, the article states that the prohibition does not apply to dark patterns that are covered by the GDPR and the UCPD. As I just mentioned, the UCPD and the GDPR don't really explicitly regulate dark patterns. And it also is not clear what not covered means in this context. Do we need first formal decisions under the UCPD and the GDPR? So I think this provision could make the job of enforcers more difficult.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that amazing overview of a very complex patchwork. And one of the things that struck me was that at the EU level, a lot of the regulation seems to apply, in terms of powerful platforms and large platforms, whereas at a national level, they maybe have more general application. And I wondered, from the point of view of a regulator, Dries, how are you thinking about this landscape in terms of what do regulators need, what skills do they need, how are they tooling up to be able to address these kind of issues in deceptive design?
Yeah, thank you very much, Kush. And I think there's two parts to that question, really. The one is more the substantive law part, and one maybe is more in terms of what capabilities do we need, do we deploy, right? So I think starting with the first one, the substantive law part, I totally agree with what was mentioned by Constanta, and I think my take from the current legislation is that I think the way the DSA in Article 25 and its exemption as is currently drafted still makes the UCPD a very important instrument, and I think it will continue to be. So that's also why we very much focus on the fitness check that you mentioned, which the Commission is currently undertaking to see if European consumer law is still fit for purpose in the digital domain, and specifically also in relation to deceptive design. So the Commission had a consultation last year, and we made a submission where we pointed out a few things, which goes onto your questions, what we think we need in terms of legislation to be better able to enforce the space. And I think a couple of things are probably worth mentioning very quickly. The first one is that we think we could use a duty of care. So just a broad duty on the business community to say you need to make sure that your design is fair, period. So that would open up a lot of possibilities for us to enforce. Secondly, there are some very clear-cut things, techniques being used that are obviously harmful and cannot be anything else than harmful. So, for example, repetitive countdown timers, low stock, apologies, low stock messages that are not real. So saying there's only 2 items left, whereas in fact there may be 25 left. Forced action, for example, the case that we did jointly with the consumer agencies in Europe against Meta, saying that the way they forced the changes in the terms and conditions upon consumers a couple of years ago is unacceptable. So these things we can just clearly prohibit or blacklist. Then I already mentioned Amazon and the legislation in France and Germany. I think we may be able to convey certain design principles, high-level design principles to the market and say, if you're going about designing this, you should at least do this. And, the cancellation example is a great one. You cannot use more than 2 clicks. You cannot demand more than 2 clicks for someone to cancel a subscription, as an example. And I think the final one, and this is might be a bit technical, but I think it's really important. So you need to understand that dark patterns are only drafted or created sometimes by the businesses that deploy them. very often, and especially for smaller and medium-sized businesses, they're not created by the business itself. They are either software that they bought, which was used as a plugin on their website. It's either an online media firm that they hired that implemented those techniques on their website, or it's even a platform like Shopify. And this is not to blame Shopify, it's just, to give you an idea what I'm talking about. Shopify that offers, a ready-made website with all the tooling and services that you need. Now, this tooling very often contains options that can actually materialize as dark patterns when you use them on your website. Currently, none of these businesses fall under the liability of consumer protection law. So there's nothing we can do as an enforcement agency to address those businesses while they play a very important role in this chain of events. So I think that's where we would hope to see change. And then very quickly on the capabilities, I'll try and cut it short here. I think we, as the ACM, have moved in terms of understanding both behavior as well as the technical side of dark patterns. So I usually say dark patterns are being driven by three things: psychological insight, collection of data, and technology, basically being AI, which is now being sped up by generative AI. Well, on the data collection, we're not the authority in the Netherlands that is responsible. But we need to make sure that we understand the behavioral side of things and the technical side. So we've got two different units, a behavioral unit and a data and AI unit, that are really specialized in helping us understand what's happening and being able to really enforce and investigate the techniques that are being used to deploy dark patterns. And I think that needs to continue.
Yeah, thank you. And from the point of view of kind of understanding the consumer, I think that's a good point to take the conversation, because one of the things that we discussed already is that in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, there's discussion of the rational consumer, isn't there? There's a test that refers to consumers being rational. And Constanta, I wondered what your view was on that, and whether you thought that works in practice, or what needs to change because consumers are not necessarily always rational. And
indeed, we're not. I'll first explain how it works, and then I'll go to what needs to be changed. But to give you a taste, I think it's something that's difficult to change. But in essence, the UCPD uses the average consumer benchmark, which is a well-informed and circumspect consumer. So it's a consumer image that's very close to the Homo economicus from neoclassical economics. And for this kind of consumer, more information is always better. So the way consumer protection has been approached for a long time in the EU is through the information paradigm, which means assuming a rational average consumer and requiring traders to disclose information to this average consumer. And I think that a regulatory framework that relies on this consumer image and doesn't really grapple with bounded rationality and imposes a lot of information duties on traders could possibly exacerbate some of the issues that we face in digital environments, and it could also create some additional issues. So in terms of additional issues, we're constantly bombarded by information in an online space. It can be consent banners, which come from data protection law, but it can also be product information or information about a trader. If the law doesn't have provisions on how information should be presented, when information is important for us, then we could be speaking of information overload. In terms of exacerbating issues, again, if the law doesn't provide when information should be disclosed and how, then some traders might exploit this gap in the law. So, for example, we haven't spoken about hidden costs, but hidden costs basically entails that you're shown one price when you see a product page, and at a very late stage in the transactional process, some additional charges, usually high charges, are added. And this is a dark pattern that relies on The fact that we're so invested in the process at that point that we're unlikely to go back and look for someone who actually discloses the price. And the law at the moment requires full price information to be disclosed at the moment when we check out. The UCPD refers to timely presentation of information, but timely is a very broad term. It's not on the product page. So in this regard, I think not having some design duties, like Dries was talking about, including for the presentation of information, can lead to abuses. And I think the last shortcoming that we may face when we assume when we assume rationality is the fact that a rational consumer is supposed to withstand some commercial pressure. So, for example, pressure stemming from scarcity measures like countdown timers that Dries mentioned. That's the sort of pressure we should be able to withstand to some extent, because there will be, advertising always involves an influence on our behavior, but the job of the law is to determine where that influence becomes unlawful. So I think all in all the regime could be improved from on these particular points. As to why it's difficult to address it is because the average consumer benchmark doesn't just serve a consumer protection goal in the EU, it also serves a harmonization goal. So before the ECPD was adopted, member states regulated unfair commercial practices at a national level. So the laws were different. And in order to allow national courts to assess practices in a uniform manner, so we could speak of European consumer protection, this benchmark was adopted. So I think it's very difficult to imagine something that's more, it's closer to how we actually behave, but still remains operational and can also serve the harmonization goal.
And Dries, do you have anything to add to that on the rational consumer?
Yeah, just without trying to repeat what Constanta so eloquently said, I think I have an anecdote that I want to share. So when we were writing the guidelines, by the way, the guidelines that we published on the protection of the online consumer and dark patterns can be found on our website, and they are a way of trying to create the legal certainty that you spoke about on the UCPD and its open norms. So when we were writing those guidelines, we had an external expert group. One of the people on that expert group was a seasoned psychologist, UX designer, A/B tester with a huge moral compass, and he was helping us out. So at some point he said to me, all right, tell me, how does that work with the law? Because I don't understand exactly what's prohibited. So I tried explaining him, this is an unfair commercial practice, and we do have to do a transaction test where we see whether consumers are affected by the practice, and then in order to do that, we have a yardstick, which is the average consumer. And the average consumer is defined by the European courts as, and I wrote it down because I can never remember, the reasonably well-informed and reasonably observant and circumspect person. Well,
I missed one.
He fell silent. He looked at me and he said, I have never, ever in my life come across a consumer like that. And I was like, okay, point taken. So I think, despite understanding all the difficulties about redefining this concept, I think we need to redefine it. And I think we need to redefine it in a way that it will automatically raise the protection offered by current legislation, right? Because if the test becomes harder, the protection of the law becomes higher. So I think we need to really be more human-centric in this sense. I think the Court of Justice either should take a turn or the legislator has to take a turn. And we need to adapt this and make this more in line with human capabilities. And I think the second point to very briefly touch on is this was a recommendation in our submission to the Commission on the fitness check. Another one was, which is really closely related to this, and you mentioned it both at the same time as well, is transparency. So it almost seems a legislative default to create transparency requirements if we have an asymmetry. So if there is a lot of information disbalance between the consumer and the business. And then usually the legislator says, right, let's create an obligation on the business to provide the consumer with a business, sort it. Well, it doesn't work that way. And we know now, and there is a lot of evidence out there that doesn't work that way. So one of the other recommendations in our submission is we have to be really careful with trying to solve issues solely by implementing new transparency requirements. Let's only do so if we really know they work, and let's test them whether they work or not. If they don't work, let's just look at prohibiting the practice.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an excellent overview. And I work very closely with a user researcher, and one of the things that occurs to us quite often is the impact of habituation on consumers, and the fact that consumer behavior also changes over time as well. And I wondered if either of you had any thoughts on how you can legislate and how you can regulate for the fact that consumers also will change our behavior as new technologies are introduced, and we become habituated to them.
Would you like to go first?
Happy to. Yeah, also happy for you to go first.
Constanta, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think that's exactly why it's so difficult to link benchmark like the average consumer to behavioral insights, because new knowledge about consumer behavior is constantly going to emerge, but also because we are not always affected by the same cognitive biases to the same extent. So I think this could lead to various levels of protection, and it would also lead to a need to constantly update benchmark, including to account for habituation effects, like you mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting debate, and probably not something that we'll solve here today, sitting here. But my thoughts are really on the consumer protection side, thinking, yes, probably habituation will take place in relation to certain practices, and certain practices probably not. So let's first of all try and distinguish those. And where no habituation will take place, we need to be strict, right? Where it will take place, my consideration is, how are we going about the transition period? Are we still going to accept the harms to consumers that are being inflicted by those practices? And what we see in terms of developments in the digital space, developments go so fast that by the time people are habituated to one practice, the next is already there. So are we not continually having consumers running behind and therefore experiencing harm all the time? And do we think that's acceptable? I don't think, I haven't got the answer straight away, but this is something that I think about when speaking about habituation.
Yeah, it's a question I've not really seen discussed as much in academic circles and regulatory circles, but seems to be one that we need to take account of at this moment in time to be able to regulate in future. And Dries, you mentioned the Court of Justice earlier when you talked about it. Obviously, a lot of these cases will end up before the courts, inevitably. And I wondered how well equipped you thought they were to be able to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, so it'll probably take some time before they end up in the Court of Justice. But so I really don't know how well equipped the Court of Justice is. But speaking about the Dutch courts, which are much closer to home and also to this place, I think we're in a pretty good position. Of course, things can be improved, but I would say that we're blessed with a specialized court that deals with our cases. So this is not necessarily the case, right, for people that go to a civil court to maybe contest some of these practices. But in terms of the administrative decisions that we take, the fines that we put out there, they will be tested in a specialized court which deals with economic affairs, and to my mind has a growing understanding of these practices and is definitely, on board with many of the concepts that we're speaking about. Like I said, things can be improved, but I don't think we're particularly poor off considering some other countries in Europe.
And Constanta, what about the more European perspective?
From a European perspective, empirical evidence is not needed. So the UCPD states that the average consumer test is not a statistical test. Also, when we look at whether a consumer's decision is influenced, what we're looking at is the likelihood that that decision will be influenced. So these are both legal tests, which don't need to be backed by empirical evidence. And I think, if anything, it could be quite difficult to reconcile empirical evidence which points to consumers not being rational in relation to a particular commercial practice, that would be difficult to reconcile with an average consumer standard that is pointing at a rational consumer.
So we think the courts should be in a decent place given the way the regime is set up. And I wanted to kind of switch the focus a little bit to companies. We talked about consumers quite a lot and the fact that they shouldn't necessarily bear the burden for this. But so where does the balance lie between, on the one hand, regulators and legislators, and on the other hand, UX designers, product managers, the people that bring these services to market? Constanta, perhaps I can start with you and see what you think about who bears responsibility for dealing with dark patterns and ensuring ethical design.
I think both, but there is something that I think is frequently overlooked in the literature on dark patterns and also in some policy attempts, and that's the fact that not all businesses are created equal. So Dries already mentioned the small and medium-sized enterprises, which might be misled by the CMSs that they use, or the website builders that they use, or the consent management platforms that they use. They might also have one UX designer in their team who will, so it's quite common actually, there's some studies on this, for UX designers to look for advice on how to comply with the GDPR on Stack Overflow. And I think that this need stems from the fact that the law is principle-based, so it operates with very broad standards that designers then have to translate, or businesses have to translate. And there will, of course, be businesses that are able to stretch the law to the limits of imagination, so they'll try to circumvent it. But there will also be businesses that will have a very hard job complying. So I think in that regard, some of the initiatives that Dries mentioned before, like having clear prohibitions, having specific design duties, such as for a cancellation process, 2 clicks and you should be done. Green button, this is where you place it on an interface. I think this could already go a long way into remedying some of the unintended breaches that come from not being very familiar with a very wide host of regulatory instruments, as we saw earlier. But it could also help prevent avoidance of the law where that is intended and where that is by design.
Thank you. And Dries, what is your view on that?
Yes, I think, besides the fact that, of course, the legislative and regulators and consumers have a role to play here, and probably an important one, primarily this problem is caused by the business community, and I think that's also where we need to find the solution. I think the solution is not going to be an easy one. It's probably going to require a lot of collaboration with all the different stakeholders in society, and we've been playing a role in that over the last 4 years very actively. But I think what we still see when we speak to businesses, which we regularly do, when we look at their practices, is there is such a strong and single focus on conversion optimization within marketing, within design communities and departments. And they really need to make a shift. There needs to be a change towards, a more human-centric and not just making as much money as we can. And I think this is also going to be important in the future with, markets that become saturated. There's not so many new customers out there anymore. So you need to retain the consumers that you have, the customers that you have. And then it becomes important that customers do not feel deceived, right? So I think there's even a business case to be made for this. I think that is really important. This requires, first of all, I think, good governance, right? So you need to have your process in place in a business to make sure that you ask yourself the questions, what are we doing? What are the effects of the practices that we put out there? And, with our guidelines, we're trying to reach out and provide some help. But as you said, both, there's a very practical level to which designers and marketeers may need guidance where we are not even in a position to give it. And we don't want to, and we can't, simply in terms of capacity. So I think what really would help there is some cooperation within the business community. And we see sort of first initiatives, which I think are pretty hopeful, of businesses trying to, for example, collectively measure the effects of practices. And I think that can inform, to a very practical degree, the professionals working in these areas and provide them with the knowledge, the guidance that they need to make this shift. And just to close, I mean, in the end, shareholders are going to push all the decisions that are going to be made by businesses. We need more shareholders that, take a human-centric approach, and I'm not sure how to change that. But.
Yeah, that was exactly the point that I was going to make in response to what you said, which is that often business decisions are driven, by what shareholders think. And as much as you may want to hire ethical designers and ethicists, you really need that push from above to be able to.
And maybe to emphasize, there's nothing wrong with making money. It's just too single-minded focus on making money. That's the problem.
Mm-hmm. And sticking with products, I just wanted to kind of touch on where the market is going. We saw that Apple released its new VR headset, and there's augmented reality, virtual reality, generative AI as well. And I wondered what that means for dark patterns and for regulation of dark patterns as well. And what do we think is coming next? Constanta?
So I think it's something that regulators and policymakers should definitely keep an eye on. There are some studies from the computer science side of the literature that are already starting to look at dark patterns in voice interfaces, for example, and there are studies that point to XR, VR, potentially creating additional vectors of exploitation. So in that regard, I also think that what can be done at a policy level is having some technology neutrality in terms of not referring to a graphical user interface, for example, so that voice interfaces are covered. So I think technology neutrality has in the past been proven to be a very effective tool at future-proofing the law. But at the same time, a balance needs to be struck, I think, between having a catch-all provision that will apply also in the future, but also providing some more guidance to market participants.
Mm-hmm. Dries?
Yeah, I can only totally agree with what you say. Maybe just to add that I think our conclusion is that, these developments do certainly exacerbate some of the risks that we see in terms of deceptive design, where, for example, immersive spaces like VR and AR provide so many more options to influence people and to manipulate people into certain directions. So we have to be really, really on the ball there to see what's happening and, to make sure that that does not create, and it probably will, some very high risk applications. I think in terms of generative AI, I mean, the acceleration of the possibilities of AI that we're currently seeing also create additional risks in terms of deceptive design, right? So again, possibilities to collect data, to predict consumer behavior, to really, on a very granular personal level, decide what someone is susceptible to and create that specific influencing technique in a digital space, whether it's an app, a website, or a game, will become so much easier and so much more low cost that it's only going to increase the risk, I think.
Something to keep an eye on. And I'm conscious I've taken up a lot of time after talking to you both, and it's been fascinating. But I'd love to open it up as well to questions from the audience. So I'll pass it to Jifa.
Yeah. Any questions?
Thank you so much. This was so informative, and I would love to see also more journalism on these topics, because this is about information that everybody needs to know. So I have a possibly difficult question about the word dark and black. So it feels really surprising to me to be hearing these words in such a negative context, especially because there's so much focus on being very precise with language in all other ways, and deceptive and legal and everything. So I'm curious if there's any move away from this language, which can be racist and is kind of, I thought it was done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And just to give an initial thought, I mean, we've called this deceptive design, and you're right, we should be referring it to as deceptive design. I think that's a really, really good point. And if either of you have any thoughts, feel free to jump in.
Can I add one thing? Because the thing is, we at the ACM have never used the term. We didn't like it. And one of the reasons why we've never used it, and that's something else completely than you refer to, but is the term dark seems to imply some sort of intent required, that you're doing something deliberately. But actually, if you look at consumer law, European consumer protection law, even having a technique that misleads consumers, whether it was intentionally or not, is a violation of the law. And that's the reason why we never use the term dark patterns, because it seems to require some sort of intent, which is not required.
If I may add to that, some have also suggested some terms that I think capture the fact that, so we've seen at the beginning that the literature doesn't always draw a connection between the practices that are described and normative considerations. So Caroline Sinders has proposed the term damaging patterns, which I personally like very much because, like Dries said, dark patterns doesn't also convey in a straightforward way what the practice actually is for practical purposes. And also because deceptiveness is one thing in the law, but it's misleadingness, it's untruthful information, and it doesn't cover manipulation. So I think damaging patterns could perhaps be an umbrella term for both of these branches.
Thank you. Something for us all to think about.
And the great thing about that is it keeps the acronym alive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other question. Ooh, other side. Keeping me on my toes. I love it.
Thank you very much. Hi, my name is Anais, and I'm a UX designer. I've been lucky enough in my career so far to have worked at companies who listened to me when I noticed a tendency towards dark patterns. However, if I were, again, the sole designer to 200 people company, and the company is very focused on the money-bringing side, what power does my voice have against developing dark patterns, given that they can always just hire a junior designer and pressure them into developing that dark pattern, or going behind my back straight to developers and doing it?
Yeah, excellent question. Constanta, would you like to start?
Thank you for your point. That's exactly why I myself am hesitant to call out UX designers specifically, or to say that these designs were intended. They aren't always intended, and you as UX designers face a lot of pressures within a company that may come from above, that may come from legal, that may come from marketing. So I think it's important to acknowledge that when talking about the role of UX designers in designing this kind of practices.
Thank you. Dries?
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's why also we are focusing, for example, on creating good governance and shifting an ethic as within a business as a whole, and making procedures available for people to speak up, and making that a safe thing to do. Because I totally get what you're saying, and it's absolutely true. Yeah.
And I think also having deceptive design and damaging patterns in the mainstream conversation helps people like you as well to be able to make the case for designing things in a certain way. And so hopefully this will contribute to that as well. Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting conversation. I'd like to dig in a bit more into the relationship between the DSA, UCPD, and GDPR. Talking from a perspective of the organization, one of the organizations that did advocacy around that provision in the DSA. Even though we were aware that there is already GDPR and UCPD in place, we wanted the DSA provision on the dark patterns to be there, because we felt that we need some more specific guidelines and prohibitions that would concern online platforms. And even though we knew that UCPD and GDPR could be interpreted in a progressive way, that could, in theory, cover broad practice of designing deceptive interfaces, for example. For some reason, the dark patterns were still there. So we were kind of disappointed when those exceptions referring to UCPD and the GDPR were added in, I believe, a very last stage of a trilogue. And now we are also kind of confused what's the actual added value of the DSA provision then, because for the reason, because the UCPD and GDPR could be broadly interpreted, I'm wondering if you could maybe point me out to specific situations or, I don't know, examples that you think that the DSA could be safely applied to, where basically you couldn't say that these instances are already covered by UCPD and the GDPR.
Thank you. It's a really good question. And Constanta, I know you touched on this earlier. Do you want to go into a bit more depth?
I think it's a fantastic question, and that's exactly where my concerns also lie. I think it's very difficult to imagine a situation where the DSA would prove more relevant, I think.
And Dries?
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying, and initially I had the same confusion. I think my confusion has actually shifted to a bit more optimism. Optimism in the sense that there already is a lot of guidance, case law and work being done in relation to dark patterns, or whatever we call them, based on the GDPR and the UCPD. If we were to resort to Article 25 of the DSA, we would probably have to start all over again. So the beauty of having this exemption, I think, is that we can take along all the work that has already been developed. And to my mind, Article 25 provides some sort of a safety net where if for some reason we cannot use the UCPD, we cannot use the GDPR in relation to big platforms, there is something else that we could use. But that still needs to be developed fully. So it's pretty hard to get, at this moment in time, sort of understand what that will mean. But I'm sure it will be developed. But I'm very glad that we're not throwing away what we already had.
Thank you. And we've got time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, maybe check this side.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for your talk. I have a question for Constanta mostly. So you mentioned already more the normative considerations and implications. So I'm thinking dark patterns, especially in the context of information and so on, can also have implications for more fundamental rights like freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and opinion manipulation and so on. Where do you see the potential of consumer law to move beyond its more traditional scope to actually be effective in addressing fundamental rights concerns?
I think consumer law is still very focused on economic interests, but I think the line between economic and non-economic interests is very blurred in the digital space. So DCPD has, for example, in the WhatsApp case that Dries mentioned before, been used to tackle the way WhatsApp was presenting its privacy policy to its users. So I think these boundaries are getting blurrier and blurrier, and that's a good thing. I know that some stakeholders in the context of the Commission's fitness check have explicitly called for abolishing this distinction between us as citizens and us as users, particularly with regards to concerns related to data protection, which is also a fundamental right.
Thank you. And Dries, another question was for Constanta, but if you have anything to add, feel free.
Just to add that I think the DSA is going to open up this playing field completely. We're going to be also the DSA coordinator, and we're already preparing to think outside, the transactional economic boundaries that we have been mostly thinking within. So that process is already happening based on DSA, I would say.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to our amazing panelists. We had a really excellent, really rich discussion, which we can continue online and in the future as well. So thanks everyone for joining us. Please join me in thanking our great panelists.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kush, Dries, and Constanta, hope we're all a bit better prepared for these deceptive patterns and spread the word, because a lot of more people should know this. For now, we are going to change the settings up in here. Go and check out the other amazing sessions and installations around. For instance, you can still get a free coffee at the Ethical Dilemma Cafe, and the wall is filling up really nicely. So, or you could decide to pay in traditional currency if your data is too dear to your heart. Check out the lounge, where you can experience a selection of interactive art installations. You can learn more about how TikTok is quietly manipulating the way we see the world. Or you could provide some feedback to the digital human rights projects from students of In Holland University of Applied Sciences. And definitely come back here at 2 for the final dialogues and debates conversation about the influence of influencer culture. So see you guys later. Okay.